is probably at the best time and at the best place. Because the Mexican immigrant community that we have here in Los Angeles bought that with them. They not only bought their labor, their work, but they also bought their ideas. And these ideas are nurtured in many of the families of this community in the 20s and 30s. And what comes to my mind are the words of a Mexican historian, Ramon Ruiz, who accounted where his love for Mexican history and his writing for Mexican history began. And it was at the family dinner table, where his father would recount episodes of the revolution. That is not an isolated situation. Many families at this time went through this process of sharing this history, valuing this history, this heritage of revolution. And one also finds in the Unionists at this point in time, activists, farm worker organizers, other trade unions, is very much part of their world is the revolution. Part of their world is the significance of the revolution. In many ways, that revolutionary heritage that they have in the 30s is kind of a distilled type of heritage. One individual shared with me these words that kind of sum it up. Zapata, Villa, Carranza, all of them, they had their differences, but they were all good men. In other words, the revolution, whatever the factionalism that there was between 1910 and 1920, by the time we reach the 30s, it becomes one critical, important heritage. I'd like to share with you really a field note, which is an offshoot of my work on Decade of Betrayal. Last year, I had the opportunity of going to Detroit and doing a number of interviews. And I interviewed a couple of families, and the families told me about their relationship and experience to the Detroit Industries mural in Detroit, done by Diego Rivera. And these families told me an interesting episode that some of them would tell their children, later on as time went on, their grandchildren, it's Sunday, we need to go to church. Going to church was going to the Detroit Museum. Going to church was going into the courtyard of Detroit Industry right there that Diego Rivera constructed during his time in the United States. And these families would retell this from generation to generation. Even though the seed was planted, and it is a powerful seed, I sometimes wonder if there hadn't been a whitewashing, a covering up, what the impact could have been on the Mexican community. We all know that the 30s were a very, very difficult time. We all know that the year previous to his arrival, there was the infamous Placita raid of February of 1931, a public roundup. We all know that Los Angeles County, in that same year of 1931, in March of that year, set its first trains of so-called repatriation, unconstitutional deportation. Difficult period. But the seed was still planted, and the seed has grown. Thank you.
William Deverell is professor of history at the University of California, and he's also the director of the Huntington USC Institute on California and the West. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bill Deverell.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Jonathan. The contemporary or the traditional scholarly view of the Great Depression in Los Angeles goes something like this. The Great Depression missed Los Angeles. The Great Depression was more a phenomenon attached to the industrial or Rust Belt cities of the Midwest or the Atlantic seaboard. The Great Depression was an environmental disaster for places like the Dust Bowl, the Mid and Southwest. Or the Great Depression was felt worse in cities that had just welcomed millions of Central, Southern, and Eastern European immigrants and migrants. That's wrong on about every count. The Great Depression slammed into Los Angeles, as Professor Balderrama intimated at the last moments of his remarks. In some respects, the scholarly world, the world of American and California history and studies, has yet to fully grapple with the impact of the Great Depression out here. We don't have as much work done in that field or that era as we ought to. A couple of things are clear. For one, it's an important geographical fact to remember. More people arriving in California from, say, the Dust Bowl sending states and regions of the Mid and Southwest, more of those folks, and you imagine the Jodes making their trip out here, more of those folks turned left at Barstow than right. In other words, more people came to Southern California and Los Angeles County than went to the Central Valley. We still haven't grappled with that impact. But demographically alone, the indigent and the struggling who come here from those regions of the American West and Southwest, demographically alone, we've yet to fully grapple with the impact of that. And we know that they were here, we just haven't done as much work on it. In a more germane aspect for the topics of our conference and our exhibit and our work on Siqueiros and his world, it's reasonable to assume, at least for certain populations of Southern California, the Great Depression had already been here and been here for decades. And with that, I want to just show some images and talk a little bit about particularly the Mexican and Mexican-American community here in the first decades of the 20th century. Los Angeles, as it embarks on its extraordinary growth from the latter 19th century, the period the historians call the boom of the 80s, relatively unabated until even today, as Los Angeles embarks on its period of extraordinary growth, you can see in that map, that's an end of the 19th century bird's eye view of Los Angeles, you can see the beginnings and the implantation of gridded systems, essentially Jeffersonian systems of land use and land sale, laid atop the city, and the one meandering line in the background there, of course, is the Los Angeles River. But that gridded system is a nice metaphor, actually, for something else Los Angeles is doing from the latter 19th century forward, and that is creating spaces to which certain populations will be moved to or associated with. And in this regard, all I'm saying is that Los Angeles, from the latter 19th century forward, certainly in the period of the Mexican Revolution, 1910 up through the coming of the Great Depression and after, Los Angeles has embarked on a heavily segregated move, both in terms of racial and ethnic difference, but also occupational and residential segregation. And that impacts the Mexican-American population probably as much, if not more, than any other ethnic or racial population distinct from Anglo-America. This is a slide from the latter 19th century that shows, in some respects, metaphorically, these transitions. You see the caption there, and historians can learn a great deal from the ways in which images are captioned by the past. The caption is American and Mexican, and essentially that's a view of Los Angeles as it begins to make these transitions. In the background is the courthouse, the American period, signifying American jurisprudence and law and order, and the foreground is a Mexican adobe. And those transitions are happening very, very powerfully at the end of the 19th century, up through certainly the coming of the Great Depression, which for all intents and purposes exacerbates the segregative impulses of Los Angeles in the period. This is again around 1915 or thereabouts. Arrivals from the Mexican Revolution, who could include individuals of wealth and stature, but predominantly not, arrivals from the Mexican Revolution found work in the burgeoning industrial call for labor in California, in Southern California. Los Angeles is booming in the period. It's growing very rapidly. It's just eclipsed San Francisco as the most important city on the Pacific coast in terms of size and economic clout. And there's a great need for industrial labor. And the Mexican community answers that call in vast numbers. But of course, those are glass ceiling jobs. Those are jobs limited by labor. Those are not jobs with any opportunity for white collar movement or even up into higher positions of working class labor. Now, the appropriation of Mexican cultural attributes had been tried and true in Southern California for already many generations by the 1920s and 1930s. This is an indication of it. This is a very popular cultural event or pageant at the close of the 19th century that put Los Angeles on the mark. In some respects, it's akin to a Mardi Gras performance in New Orleans, put Los Angeles on the map culturally and in terms of economic growth. La Fiesta de Los Angeles is a week-long pageant in downtown Los Angeles of essentially historical and pageantry motifs of a week-long parades and floats, kind of Rose Bowl-ish in a sense, parades and floats that display California history to the assembled thousands, and this is rumored to have attracted a crowd upwards of 50 to 80,000, which is astonishingly big at the end of the 19th century. Week-long parade that moved through time. In other words, the floats themselves were tied to a linear progression of history, so that the earliest floats were seen to represent Aztec and Inca societies, where actually Yuma Indians and other Pueblo Indians were boxcarred in from the southwest and dressed up as Aztecs and Incas, and then through that progression of time moved rapidly through the Conquistador and Mission period, the Mexican period, and then very, very quickly got to the Anglo period, always associated with progress as opposed to backwardness, savagery, and barbarism of the earlier periods. La Fiesta shows, in some respects, the classic sort of appropriative culture of Anglo culture, trying to make something happen here in Los Angeles, built upon the foundations of a Latino past. And it's always characterized that way. The Anglo future, the darker past. And there's the Queens from one of the first La Fiestas, riding through downtown Los Angeles. It's not for nothing those women are dressed in white and with white faces. There's the school children marching in the Fiesta parades as well. Many a Los Angeles business person and builder and booster at the end of the 19th century say they can mark the maturation of Los Angeles precisely here, with the rise of La Fiesta de Los Angeles in the end of the 19th century. Even environmental features played into the segregative impulses in Los Angeles in the period. This is some of the headwaters of the Los Angeles River out towards the valley. As many of you know, the Los Angeles River is a temperamental and tempestuous river, and by the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, its propensity to flood had begun to cause more and more problems for the burgeoning metropolis. So in a region where real estate and land values are so critical to growth, a river that floods, particularly a river that has a propensity to flood through downtown districts, is a very, very problematic environmental feature. By the 19-teens, the Los Angeles River is undergoing its initial flood control work, the initial paving of the Los Angeles River around about 1916, which continues essentially unabated until today as a flood control device. But what it also does, and what we all know it does, it helps to demarcate east and west side more clearly than former demarcations, generally Main Street, had done. Main Street actually west of the river, but it was traditionally you were east of Main. That demarcated a certain neighborhood. The river became a much better demarker for, this is the river at flood stage in the 19-teens, made a much better marker for east and west side, and those east and west side demarcations on the landscape, cartographic or supplied by the river itself, became symbols for ethnic and non-ethnic, or essentially Jewish and Mexican and non-Jewish, non-Mexican, or Anglo. The labor aspects of Los Angeles, the labor segmentation is well implanted by the time Siqueiros gets here, and part of his genius is to recognize that so clearly, so quickly. It's probably an advertised fact across the American Southwest and into the Mexican Republic by the 1930s, but had Siqueiros spent any time at all looking around, he would have seen it. This is a perfect indication. This is the world's largest brickyard in the 1920s. It's out in Montebello. The Simons Brickyard number 3. Many of you probably know the Simons brick. Very popular, important brick. This plant could put out 600,000 of those bricks a day, and that's an entire Mexican labor force. Now, this is not a mural, but it's a muralesque tableau. This is an advertising tableau for the Mission play, which was up until something of the order of Annie or Cats, some other Broadway show, literally up until one of those smash hits, was the most popular theatrical performance in American history. The Mission play put on the grounds of the San Gabriel Mission, and then in what's now the San Gabriel Civic Auditorium, which was at one point the Mission Playhouse, inaugurated the week the Titanic gets sunk in 1912, put on for a couple of decades, very popular play, seen by as many as there are claims that 3 million people saw this. I doubt it's that high. I suspect 2 million, but that's still a lot of folks. And the tableau aspects of this are important. This is essentially, you see the Mission Father on your far right. This is not quite a linear historical tableau, but it's close enough. The Mission play, written by a Los Angeles Times journalist and California historian named John Stephen McGroarty, is one of these historical tableaus with as many as 300 actors on stage. And it does the progression from Native period through Spanish, Mexican, and the arrival of Anglos. And what it does is very similar to La Fiesta. In other words, a progressive notion that history gets better as it gets whiter, as well as the beatification, at least the secular beatification, of the Franciscans, and create the mythology about Franciscans as George Washington-esque figures on the California landscape. What's important about this is this tableau imagery of the progression of time, which is very common in the advertising the Mission play, is essentially, in some respects, what Siqueiros is flipping upside down. Or Siqueiros he's doing more than that. He's doing something more aggressive than that. But he's taking a kind of muralisque vision of California history, or the history of the American Southwest, and he's rendering it essentially obscene and certainly obsolete. And his articulateness and his ability to grasp that, particularly when we remember his presence in Los Angeles is so astonishingly brief, and the productivity of his presence here is stunning. I like to match these two up because I think it does tell us a lot about not only the vision of an artist like Siqueiros, but also what he's working against. And he's working against certainly patterns of history in a place like Los Angeles, but his canvas is much bigger than that. Siqueiros' commentary stretches way back in time, and its geography is, take your pick, it's the American Southwest, it's this part of North America, it's the old world versus the new world. He's got an expansive vision about what he's up to that renders this seem quite quaint. Although, again, it's important to remember the cultural power of something like the Mission play, which not only was seen by legions of tourists who came here in the teens and 20s, but was actually written into the California curriculum for school kids who would go to see it by the busload as part of their curricular assignments to understand California and what California meant. And in many respects, what David Siqueiros is saying is, I got a different vision for you about what California means. That's the extent of my remarks. Thank you very much.
Mark Wilde is Assistant Professor of History at California State University, Los Angeles. His first book, Street Meeting, Multi-Ethnic Neighborhoods in Early 20th Century Los Angeles, was published this year. Congratulations. And his current research focuses on the relationship between religious leaders and municipal politics after World War II. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mark Wilde.
Thank you. I was asked to talk about the political history of Los Angeles in the years leading up to Siqueiros' arrival. And I imagine that when most people think of political history, they think of stuff like campaigns, elections, legislation, and bureaucracy. I don't want to ignore any of those things, but it should be apparent to anyone who has taken more than a casual glance at the city's history that the real nexus of power and the real junctions of political battle as often as not lay outside the city's conventional political sphere. One of the reasons that Siqueiros' work resonated so strongly with the working people of Los Angeles, and not just those of Mexican ancestry, is that it depicts politics at the vantage point from which many of them participated in it. It was the politics illustrated in Siqueiros' mural Street Meeting, the politics that took place almost literally in the shadow of America Tropical. It was the politics of the street, for the street in the 19-teens, 1920s, and 1930s was where many of the most visceral conflicts between different groups of Angelenos played out. And when we look at Siqueiros' work in LA and at its reception, we see, I would argue, a microcosm of a larger struggle, a fundamental struggle for political power that raged hot and cold for decades before his arrival. Before I talk about this larger struggle, before I talk about what Los Angeles politics during this time was, I'll first say something about what it was not. In the early decades of the 20th century, Southern California is one of the fastest growing regions in the world. But compared to their counterparts in other places, the working class newcomers that accounted for the bulk of this growth found few opportunities to participate in its political development. Los Angeles had, for instance, no effective ethnic political machine, no equivalents to Tammany Hall or Boss Tweed. This entry point into politics that organized the lives of so many European immigrants in other American cities scarcely existed here. And if it wasn't available for immigrant whites, it certainly wasn't for residents of color. After Anglos expelled the last of LA's Mexican leadership from public office in the 1870s, Mexican Angelenos had to wait for the better part of a century until after World War II before they gathered enough strength to elect another of their own to city government in the form of Ed Roybal. African Americans fared little better. Douglas Flaming, in his recent study Bound for Freedom, has elegantly documented a wide and varied tradition of political activism among the city's black community, which did manage to send a few representatives into public office. But in political terms, these were tokens. And if one measures influence by access to City Hall, then theirs pales in comparison to that of the Central Avenue vice operators who routinely cut deals with government officials. If electoral politics provided few outlets for immigrant and working class Angelenos, labor organizing picked up little of the slack. In San Francisco, unions became powerful enough to seize control of the mayor's office by the first decade of the 20th century, but the story was quite different in Los Angeles. Hamstrung by well-organized opposition, a highly transient workforce, and levels of prejudice that excluded large segments of the city's population, local unions failed to influence city politics by conventional means. Tellingly, the most significant labor action in Los Angeles history during these years was not a strike, but an act of terrorism, the notorious 1910 bombing of the Los Angeles Times building that killed 21 people and cemented the already well-established image of unions as fringe element groups. If one looks away from the working class leaders and organizations, it is difficult to find in Los Angeles of this era even a charismatic politician regardless of background. Those who occupied the mayor's office in the years leading up to Siqueiros' arrival were characterized by a lack of character, a collection of largely colorless personalities distinguished only by their general amenability to graft. I don't think I get too much of an argument from the historians in the room if I suggested that the most well-known civil servant from this period was William Mulholland, the city engineer and architect of the Los Angeles Aqueduct, who never ran for public office in his life. Mulholland, temperamentally at least, was hardly a man of the people. And without diminishing his significant accomplishments, I would suggest that the attention he has received speaks at least in part to the political poverty of the elected public officials of his time. So if we can't find power in these more traditional kinds of urban political institutions, where can we find it? The answer, of course, lies with those who stunted the political machines, suppressed the labor unions, and rendered most politicians irrelevant to the city's destiny. The real center of political power lay with the institutions created by the business elites of the city, the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce, the Merchants and Manufacturing Association, and perhaps most spectacularly the Los Angeles Times, whose bombastic owners Harrison Gray Otis and Harry Chandler nudged, coaxed, and often as not wrenched the city into the path they chose for it. This select group of Angelenos had one overwhelming goal, to stoke the economic engine of Los Angeles, and they were extremely good at it, setting the city on a barreling pace of growth that not incidentally made them a fabulous amount of money. When limited water supplies threatened the city's expansion, they searched hundreds of miles up the eastern side of California to find another source. The Los Angeles aqueduct that brought water from the Owens Valley back to the city was for Mulholland, the designer, a triumph of engineering. It was for city government a triumph of bureaucratic efficiency to a scale that would be almost unimaginable today. And last but not least, it was a financial triumph. For Los Angeles as a whole, yes, now that it could vault over one of the many natural obstacles to expansion, but in particular for a handful of well-connected speculators who quietly bought up the almost uninhabited San Fernando Valley, a place that many Angelenos of the time could probably not find on a map, and as the aqueduct approached completion, arranged for the annexation of that valley to the city. That ploy, and the subsequent windfall it produced, inspired Hollywood writer Robert Towne to pen a screenplay about corruption eating at the core of Los Angeles. He called his movie Chinatown, but I always thought that the title deceives and misdirects, just like the film's aptly named villain, Noah Cross. By the time of the aqueduct, LA's Chinatown harbored only remnants of the vice industries that had once flourished there, and even in its heyday, the denizens of that district conned only the tiniest fraction of what some of its well-heeled neighbors, looking down on it from plush offices on the other side of Main Street, pulled in. The aqueduct and its economic consequences encapsulated in many ways the course of power in Los Angeles. Chandler and the Chamber of Commerce spoke of the common benefits of growth, but it was clear that certain citizens benefited first and foremost, and not so clear for some Angelenos how far those benefits extended to them. A rising tide may lift all boats, but what about those without a boat, or those without a union, or a representative in City Hall, or their own newspaper? By the turn of the century, Angelenos disenfranchised literally or figuratively began to cast around for a new way to make their presence felt. And some of them found it in the streets of downtown, under the noses of those who had thwarted them in so many other ways. The political activity of working-class Angelenos took many forms. Some efforts centered primarily within a specific ethnic community, while some sought to build alliances across the many communities that inhabited the Los Angeles landscape. I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about the second group, the coalitions. And the reason I'm doing this is not to belittle the ethnic-specific movements, which played a vital role in their respective